Sense of Soul. It's time to awaken.
Today on Sense of Soul, we have Jonathan Labman. He is one of the leading spiritual awakening experts in the world. With 4 inspiring books, a weekly Substack column he writes called Simply Awake, and has a psychotherapy practice that has transformed thousands of lives for the past 25 plus years. After years of childhood abuse and life in a religious cult, John has helped thousands of people go from the constant hustle, anxiety, and exhaustion from success to living a life of peace and fulfillment while still crushing their goals. Please welcome John.
Good morning,
Hello,
Shanna.
how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm finding cords. I'm not really sure where something's not plugged in. I'm like, wait a second.
Okay.
Probably just an extra one.
Yeah, where are you located?
I'm in Colorado. How about you?
Okay, I'm in Pennsylvania,
Oh,
close to the border, the eastern border of Pennsylvania, the Delaware River.
oh, I've never been there before.
It's pretty country out here. I've been to Colorado only once for about a week, but
Yeah.
I didn't get to see much of the country. I was in a seminar, so
Oh,
come back someday.
yeah. It's pretty. It's pretty
Mm-hmm.
here. I'm super excited to hear your story.
Oh, thank
But
you.
yeah, it's going to be such a great conversation because I feel like this is something that I kind of am passionate about when it comes to, I mean, I feel like I've been grieving my religion for a long time. Grew up
Mm-hmm.
Catholic. So I'm originally from
Yeah.
New Orleans, and
Ah.
my family's been there since late 1600s. So it's deeply rooted in me, my religion.
Mm-hmm.
And, me even speaking out about this, I mean, I'm a heretic for sure. So,
I know, and I work with so many former Catholics. I swear to goodness, I must be formerly Irish priest because especially Irish Catholics seem to flock here, although there are plenty in the area, you know.
wow. Well, one of the things I had learned, I also study ancestry and I help people also do their genealogy. And one
Hmm.
thing I had learned and I was very surprised about, and I don't think a lot of people know, is that almost all of the lineages, almost all of them, I can't think really of one on both sides, were forced to be Catholic.
Oh yeah, that's not surprising either. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
law. It was in the Black Code, and I actually found an ancestor who was on like one of those first 5 boats that traveled from France to Port of New Orleans, and he was
Hmm.
actually German. So the Germans and the Swiss also went over with the French, and his job was he was witness on the boat that when you got on that you were baptized, and if you weren't, you would be baptized right there.
Wow.
So it was a little,
Yeah.
it's a little shocking to me. And I was already going through my journey living from my own experiences rather than what I'd been told.
Hmm.
So I'm curious just to know your story and how you got to where you are. And, if you don't mind to share how this spiritual journey started for you.
First of all, thanks again for having me on the show. And I always like to open by saying to the listeners, please support Shanna's work, give her 5-star ratings and likes, and share her podcast because this is a place where we learn all the things we weren't taught in school and by our religious leaders. And Shanna, I know that I'm trying to ramp up technical abilities. At my age, I'm almost 70, and I know that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. So I wanted to acknowledge that for you and for your listeners and to say thank you so much.
Oh, I appreciate that.
And then I'll be glad to answer your questions. So I call my work liberation therapy
Mm,
because I've been melding the psychological and the spiritual together really my whole life, but professionally since I became, well, probably in 2000 when I got my degree as a counseling psychologist. I was right away in a program to become a yoga teacher. At the same time, like as soon as I finished the one, I went into the other. And at that time, I had my initial spiritual awakening. And so I've been trying to combine both since. And even my thesis was on whether yoga was compatible with psychotherapy, yoga philosophy. And I found, in fact, it was. And there were quite a few early psychologists like Carl Gustav Jung and Roberto Ascioli, who were very adept in yoga and were using some of the ideas. And so that's where I am now. How I got here, I'm not going to try to tell 70 years worth of stories. Trust me, and your audience will be asleep if I do. But I grew up with sexual abuse at home. And, some listeners may have that experience, and bullying at school. And I know a lot of people have that experience. And by the time I was 15, I was pretty much coming home every day with a headache because I was so tense and anxious and panicky most of the time. Somebody came to our 10th grade class and showed us a film of an international high school in Wales, on the South Sea coast of Wales. That was going to be the last 2 years of school, in a castle that had been owned by William Randolph Hearst. And something in me just leapt up and said, and took me to the front of that room and signed up to apply to go there. And at about the same time, I thought, I want to investigate Christianity, because I had been raised in a Reformed Jewish tradition, and my tradition, sorry to any Reformed Jews listening, but to me, it felt as dry as death. It was so dusty and so boring and so devoid of what I would call spirit that I didn't have any sense of being at home there. And so in the process of studying the New Testament and asking whether there was a God at all, because I wasn't sure I believed in God, I got an offer letter to the school to go, but my parents said, if you don't get a scholarship, we can't afford to send you there for you to send to college, and we're just middle-class people. So there was also a postal strike. This was 1971. There's no email. Long distance was impossible to pay for. And so I was on my knees praying for a month. God, if you exist, prove it to me. Very arrogant, right? I would never do that now. By getting me the scholarship that I'm not supposed to get. And I got the scholarship. I waited a whole month and I got that letter in the mail May 1st. And that was a moment that changed my life. And I'm sure you and audience members have those moments that really change life. And I was really ecstatic for a long time. I thought, well, this is a solution to all my problems. I get away from all my abuse and from all my trauma. I get to start over again. And now I believe in God. And that was probably the most important change that happened, was that I started having a belief. Now, my belief was very didactic and rigid. And, I was involved with the Reformed Presbyterian Church, Evangelical Synod, and the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and they're Calvinists. And like the Catholics, they believe in original sin. The first dogma of Calvinism is that you are totally depraved from the time you're born. So it's the same problem that we have in Catholicism with original sin. You come into the world, it's hard enough to be here, everybody, right? And then they slap you on the behind. You're cold and you're wet and you're hungry. And then about 2 or 3 years later, you're being taught that you're wicked and sinful. Like as if that's really going to help you, and as if it's even true. And that sets you up for a lifetime of feeling less than, feeling bad, feeling wrong, feeling shameful. And so even though I got into this wonderful school and I had these great opportunities to meet kids from 50 countries and to travel in Europe when I was young, and I got to meet some very famous evangelical people at the time. I got to go to Israel because I had a couple of my father's stepbrothers living there. Even though all that happened, it didn't solve my internal problems. And some of those I wasn't even aware of. I wasn't aware of my abuse until I was 52 years old. I didn't remember any of it. And this is something that audience members may be quite savvy about by now, that trauma can often remain hidden.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I kept doing was kind of looking for people who reminded me of the person who traumatized me. And unfortunately, in my case, it was my mother who traumatized me. It was very unusual. And not only me, but others. And then I kept looking for leaders and spiritual leaders who reminded me of that experience, which Freud calls repetition compulsion. So if you repeat a behavior over and over again and you feel like, I don't know why I'm doing this, I know this isn't going to be good, it's a repetition compulsion. You're trying to remember something that happened to you, and you
Right.
keep seeking out the kind of people that did that thing to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can make a lot of difficult and bad choices as a result. And I was in a Christian college eventually and was going to go to seminary. I was pre-seminary, studied ancient Greek, following up on my Hebrew studies. It's interesting. I have the languages of the Bible, even though I
Yeah.
don't know them anymore. And
Wow.
somebody, because my parents were divorcing at that time,
Mm-hmm.
I had nowhere to go. I spent one summer alone at school, just totally like adrift. And I know the audience can identify with that. So many people now are adrift. It's a very difficult culture to live in. And eventually I got invited to spend the summer in a church that was related to the denomination of the school I was going to. So I thought, oh, well, this is safe. And when I got there, I was love bombed. Nobody paid attention to me for 2 hours in my entire life, but the cult leader who ran the church. And it was a woman. And she was very pretty and she was very loving, but she was also a master at terrorizing people psychologically. So it was a perfect setup for me to repeat my childhood. And I was in that cult. I took lifetime vows to be in that group. It wasn't a cult when I started, but almost right away, the elder that I had stayed with that summer before I joined was excommunicated, and his whole family with him. And then this one family basically pushed everybody out who was in power and took over. But I had made my vows, so I was going to stay. We were celibates in our 20s, strict celibates. You had to confess in front of a group any kind of sexual sin, even a thought, right? But certainly any kind of activity. And so there was a huge amount of shame and fear always, but that was my childhood. So after about 6 years, one of the former members, many of whom were excommunicated, were tried to burn the church down. At least we think it was one of them. And then rather than the elders and the woman who really was behind the elders saying, oh, what are we doing wrong? Why has this happened? Maybe we're being too harsh. Maybe our doctrine is extreme. They said to all of us church members, you're hiding secret sins. And so that's why our church was burned down. And so now, while you're helping us to rebuild the church, you're all suspended from communion. And if you don't cough up your secret sin and you dare to walk back into the refinished church that, by the way, you're rebuilding with the sweat of your brow, you're going to be doubly damned to hell. And by the way, I did try to confess a secret sin. I thought that I was gay, even though I'd never had any experiences, but I had attractions, and that was pretty obvious to me by that time. And they said, you've never done anything, so that can't be it. And so for the next 6 months, I paced the floors in my group housing situation where 5 other guys lived, back and forth in the living room. What am I going to do? Anxious. I was given what's called a double bind, right? Two bad choices that somebody else gives you that you have to choose from. You can go into the church and be doubly damned. You can leave. And they said, yeah, if you're really gay and you leave, you're breaking your vows, you're going to hell, and you'll die of AIDS, by the way. And so at some point, some little voice inside here and here said, there's something wrong with this. Even though I took my lifetime vows, I got to get out of here. And one day when the rest of the guys were doing something else, I fled. I took all my belongings, I put them in storage. And the next day I was in a therapist's office and I was homeless for a few days.
Oh.
And so that therapist was the real turning point of my life. She said, I'm going to treat this like a divorce because you've lost your family.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything about dogma. But she said, and I was feeling very suicidal when I left. I'd lost everything except my job, my home, my friends, my spiritual community, my relationship with God. All of it was like, and I'm sure, again, listeners have gone through these things. You may have yourself. And this woman said to me, her name was Pat McGrath. She said to me, if you're coming to see me, then you must actually have some hope. And when I looked, I thought, she's right. I must have some hope. And it was the first time I'd really looked here. And
Mm-hmm.
she was instrumental in teaching me to look here where we all have to look. And that was really the turning point of my life. And I determined to come out of the closet and to pursue whatever it was I was going to pursue. But I really loved her work with me. And I kind of wanted to do that kind of work. But it took a while before I got there.
Oh my God. I mean, just the psychological damage that was, and you see it in so many systems today. Like when you were
Mhm.
talking about, the threat of if you don't do it this way, you're going to fail.
Right.
And that linear thinking, and also seeking outside of you, like the only way, and also blame and shame. And there's
Mhm.
so much damage there, and this has been happening for generations, not just in this cult, but even subtly, right? And maybe people don't even realize it, but in government, in schools, in
Absolutely.
religion.
Right. The model we get when we're little kids in this culture, and it's been this way for millennia, is even though the teacher tells us we're sinful, or the religious leader, although we think they're sinful, we're supposed to listen to them,
Yeah,
and they are supposed to be able to ferret out our secret problems and our sins and fix us. And we're supposed to listen to everything they say without questioning it at all. And that's the basic, formula for a cult. And
yeah,
there are various gradations of cult. There was the one I lived in, which was very controlling, but you could say a lot of the major religions are a kind of a cult.
yeah,
And I think there's a lot of value in a lot of the major religions, but if somebody is controlling you, audience and listeners, right? You got to ask that question, is this really the truth? Because we all have that little voice in us that says, yeah, I don't know if that's really true. And it's really what saved me from a lifetime in that cult. There are
yeah.
some people I think that are still there 40 years later.
I've been saying over the years that one of the first things that broke me open or freed me, liberation. What did you call it? Liberation.
Liberation therapy. Yeah.
Yeah, is I asked myself how much of what I believe in have I been told to believe? And of that, how much had I really experienced to be my truth? Like, could I speak on that to be true for me? And my list was so small. Love was one of those, and love for my children. I mean, that was an experience you couldn't take from me. It was a felt experience, and it was
Right.
my truth. But
That's
I
right.
mean, I hadn't been living, I mean, everything, the way that I thought I should be as an adult, what I should have as an adult, what
Mhm.
I should learn, what I should do. I mean, it all was of somebody else's in addition to my beliefs. So it was
That's right.
just a facade of this American dream or somebody's dream, but it wasn't necessarily mine.
That's right. It's really well said. And the other thing is that because we're supposed to look up to them, we never question the fact that nobody's teaching us how to be a human being, how to deal with thoughts, how to recognize that 90 to 95% of our thoughts are false. And those false thoughts create roiling, difficult, negative emotions. And then if we act on those emotions based on false thoughts, we create all kinds of drama and trouble in our lives. A lot of spirituality, and I've heard you on a couple of other podcasts refer to this, people first want to go up and out. Let me get away from my body and my problems and my psychology and my emotions and my thoughts. Can I meditate myself out of all that? And of course, we've learned to call that spiritual bypassing, right? But as a as a person who benefited so much from so many, 3 or 4 really outstanding therapists, and who eventually became a therapist, but a long way around, I feel like we really need to combine the learning how to be human with the transcendent stuff, because when I was watching, very famous teacher Rupert Spira, interacting on a group call with a bunch of people, and honestly, he was answering psychological questions more than he was answering spiritual ones. And I thought, right, that's why I like to do what I do. I want to put the two together. They belong together. You have to know how to be a human being and master what to do with your thoughts and feelings and physical sensations, and what to do with your trauma and your flashback. You have to master that before you have the bandwidth to transcend for any length of time. And we've heard stories too, and people in the audience may have experienced this, where you're meditating. Like, I've been on long meditation retreats with Adyashanti, where you're meditating, you're in silence for 6 days, and you're sitting for 40-minute sessions, 6 or 7 of them a day, I think, or 5 or 6. And some people in those report that there's a lot of fear and a lot of thought that comes up, and that just sort of really freaks them out. I had a client come to me after a 10-day meditation retreat on the West Coast, was totally flipped out because all this psychic material, this emotional material that was held inside, was kind of out. And I've just had another client come after ketamine therapy, and all of this emotional stuff is out, and nobody's ever taught him how to deal with it. Right. And so really, I think that we have to wed the psychological and the spiritual together, or at least that's what I feel like my mission is.
We're multidimensional.
Absolutely. That's right. So you talk about being outside and in connection with nature, and it's so wonderful for me too. I try to work in a permaculture garden, although it's been a labor of fail better next year. It's an interesting thing, what's going to work and what doesn't. But being in touch with nature, and now with many years of meditation, you can walk outside and disappear into the sky. There's no boundary. But you couldn't do that if you were embroiled in your own thoughts and your own drama.
Yeah.
Your listeners, if they're struggling to transcend, if they learn also the piece about how to deal with thought and emotion, and how to recognize where emotion is coming from. Is it coming from really something that happened, or your misinterpretation of that, or something you're making up in your head? Because I went to New York after working with that first therapist, because I had a trained voice. I'd been a singer most of my life, and I worked with Betty Buckley's voice coach. She was the star of Cats, and another voice coach. And they said, well, you're going to have to learn the method acting. And so I learned the method acting, and I learned about living in the moment on the stage. And later I heard about that for the first time in around 88 in spiritual circles.
Yeah.
And the next kind of transformation occurred because in that first spiritual circle that was in New York City, I was living in Philadelphia. I would take a train every night after work. We had no internet in those days, and travel to New York and walk to this meeting and sit with these people until about 9:30 at night, and get back on a train, go to Philadelphia, go to work the next day. So I was enthralled to hear that I could live in the moment, not just in some exercise in the class, but I could live that spontaneously and know what I felt and know what I was thinking, right? But I also learned that we can make up stuff in our heads that makes us feel in our bodies real feelings, but that they're coming from falsehoods. That's how actors are trained.
I actually can relate to that. I was diagnosed with ADHD as a young adult, and I was medicated for so long for anxiety and ADHD, and my memory was getting weird. So I went to my doctor. I said, I think I need to get off these meds. I was like, it's affecting me. I mean, I'm not reacting when my kids are on the roof. I mean, this is a problem, you know.
Jesus.
And I was always a very emotional person, and I couldn't even cry, John. I mean, I've always been known as a ninny baby. I was so masked and numb. And so I got off the meds, but I said, I'm going to have to do something. So I went to therapy,
Hmm.
and they suggested mindfulness, which put me in that present moment. But that's when I heard that voice. I'm like, who's talking shit to me? Who is this?
Right. Right.
And they started to do cognitive therapy with me.
Yeah,
And then they made me fill out a form, like when my thoughts came through, was it true or was it false?
that's right.
90% of it was false, and it wasn't even me. It was
That's right.
some voice, from when I was younger, some teacher or my dad or my partner. But when I sat with it, did I know that to be true about me? And I'd say more than probably almost all of it was no.
Right. Right. And it's astonishing, isn't it? It's
It's
totally
astonishing.
astonishing. The listeners who may have done cognitive behavioral therapy, or I recommend a book called Loving What Is by Byron Katie,
Hmm.
really turned my life around. And then I created a model from that I call Taming the Three-Ring Circus of Your Mind,
Ooh,
right?
I know that circus.
Yeah, Rich, there's a ring about all your thoughts about yourself, there's a ring about all your thoughts about others, there's a ring about the future, and almost always all of the thoughts are false, and all the false thoughts cause us anxiety or anger or sadness. Just like, why does a lie detector machine work? It's
Mhm.
because if we're telling a lie, the body is a truth meter. Adyashanti taught me this. The body doesn't respond well to lies. So if you're hooked up to a polygraph machine and you're telling a lie, your heart rate goes up, your perspiration goes up, your respiration goes up, your blood pressure goes up. I mean, it's not always accurate, but it's pretty good at registering the change in the body. Whether the lie is external speaker out of your mouth or you're just listening to your mind generate those lies from memory, still has the same impact. You go like this. You physiologically contract. You get anxious, you get sad, you get angry, or all three happen. Usually there's an adrenal release, right? And the emotion that comes from that is useless. So, listeners, pay attention. If the emotion that you're feeling is coming from a lie in your head, it's useless. Don't pay any attention to trying to use it for any good. It won't work, right? But if you figure out, oh, I'm really like, I need to set a boundary because somebody's really been nasty to me, and there's anger that comes up because anger is the appropriate emotion that says I need to set a boundary, then I really need to pay attention to that anger, not just stifle it, but be assertive. I don't need to be a jerk. I don't need to be insulting, but I can say, you can't talk to me like that. And so, where there's real emotion coming from real events, that's useful. And there's wisdom there. If it's emotion coming from false events, just like when I was inventing an emotion to go into a scene in my acting class, that emotion is useless. It won't move anything in a good direction, right? And
Mhm.
so once we have some idea of how to master and pay attention to our thoughts and our feelings and figure out what they're good for, if they're good for anything, now suddenly, with a couple of years of work, I discovered CBT. I mean, I studied it in grad school, but I discovered it for myself reading Byron Katie's book. And originally, I threw that book across the room. I was like, "You telling me that I've been suffering all this time? It's my fault. I hate you." And then a week later, I thought, well, what if you're right? I had to grieve the fact that I didn't know that all these years, that I was suffering unnecessarily all that time. And there's often sadness when we drop a paradigm and we pick up a new one.
Mhm.
Like your audience is, and anybody who's been a spiritual seeker, you're going to go through that series of changes, right? But that is a profoundly helpful change. And when that drama starts to drop, and when you stop believing your thoughts about the future, all kinds of possibilities open up.
Mm.
And then also, you stop believing that you're not worthy of being enlightened or liberated.
Mm.
Because a lot of people have that problem. They think, I'm wicked, I'm shameful. If listeners are survivors of abuse, they've been taught that they were guilty and wrong and bad, not the abusers. Often that's the case. And so when you start to see, like you did, that all those thoughts are false, and then some of the core ones, like I'm wicked or I'm bad or I'm wrong or I'm guilty or I'm the reason that this abuse happened, they can be kind of busted through too. They can be dissolved. And then there's room for, oh, I can be liberated. And my meditation, right, and my mindfulness practices are all about moving my awareness away from false thought and into the three-dimensional reality of the senses.
Absolutely. But I do think it is important to see counselors, do your meditation, have a team, right?
Yeah.
We'll call it a multidimensional team. You
Because
know,
they are.
yes, because when all of these things start falling, when you realize, oh my gosh, I've been listening to this false voice, I realize I've been leaving this false belief, everything falls.
Right.
And trust becomes an issue. Who do I trust? And I believe, is what you said, it is learning how to discern within thyself,
Right.
does this feel right in my body? Right?
Yes.
Does this,
Yes.
and if it does, you're not tense, you're
That's right.
relaxed and you're warm and it feels good. And when it's not, your body will tell you.
It's such an important aspect of spirituality that I don't think many people speak of as clearly as you just did, which is that your body is the means by which you experience the totality of consciousness,
Mm.
the absolute or the divine or whatever we want to call it. Of course, words really fail. And you don't have any felt experience of a future or a past. There's no sense experience of past or future. They're purely mental constructs. So we only live in the eternal now.
Mm.
And if we lose the words that separate us from everything else, it's really words that make us distinguish even awareness from what it's aware of. So, sort of kind of toward the end of liberation is I don't actually need to be an internal awareness that's separate from what I'm aware of anymore. That was useful when I was separating awareness from thought,
Mm-hmm.
but separating awareness from thought is just another thought construct.
Mm-hmm. True.
Awareness is always inextricably tied to the phenomenal universe, the three-dimensional world, the world of the senses. And a lot of what's produced up here, I now call non-sense, because it's not based on the senses. It's
Right.
iterations on thought or iterations on what just happened a minute ago. So the real experience of liberation is living in a body, being aware of all the sensations, and also being aware that a lot of the constructs that we've been given about reality are just thought forms. They're not reality. We don't even know what a full experience of reality would be because our sensory apparatus is limited to bandwidths of light and bandwidths of sound. When you start to learn to pay attention to your truth sense in your body, you free yourself from slavery to anybody else and their path. Because even my path or your path is going to be different, as you well know, from any of your listeners' paths. And everybody's got to keep going back to that truth sense, like you said. Does it relax my body?
Mm.
Oh, okay. And usually it's very simple when it relaxes the body,
Mm-hmm.
right? And also, will I be deceiving myself in some way or another? This, even in the very late stages, the last time I worked with a teacher, this question came up.
Mm.
Am I going to deceive myself if I don't have somebody watching over my shoulder?
Mm.
And I thought, wait a minute, I have a truth sense in my body. Why do I need this person over here in another country telling me that, I've finished the sixth fetter in the Buddhist fetter work?
Yeah.
It's all
I,
based, even the fetters are based on thought, right?
yeah.
You were going to ask something?
Well, I can relate because I remember, and I teach Reiki now even still, but I
Mm.
really was depending on the pendulum to
Hmm.
show me, and there was times where I was like, oh my God, I don't have my pendulum. I didn't bring it. Will I be able to sense, this person's energy
Yeah,
without my pendulum? Well, of course. And your
right.
pendulum is only an extension of your own consciousness.
That's right.
And yeah,
Right. So the tools eventually and the practices eventually, you get to drop them all.
yeah.
But you won't deceive yourself for very long if you're paying attention to your body and you notice you're going into contraction. There's some kind of self-deceit probably going on. Either
Hmm.
that or you're being triggered in flashback from some emotional issue in the past. And the other thing I would say too, to listeners in particular, is we all have a response to anything at all that's new to us,
Mm.
right? You're new to me, so my adrenaline ramps up when I'm going to meet you for the first time. And there's nothing to worry about. That'll go away. The half-life of adrenaline is 20 minutes. That'll go away. But beyond those few things, you will have a sense if you're deceiving yourself. If you're uncomfortable over a period of time, you're pursuing something that you think is right, but something inside of you doesn't agree, your
Hmm.
body will tell you, this doesn't feel right. No, right?
Yeah.
Something wrong with this, right?
Hmm. Isn't that amazing? It's so true. I
It's
always laugh,
wonderful.
like having, four children. I remember how hard it was with my first one, not really knowing what to do. And I was in my early 20s and nervous, I'm bringing this baby home with me. Well, God, where's my mom? But
Right.
everyone had lots of advice, as all people do, of how to
Yeah.
do it, and then they had this big book, What to Expect When You're Expecting, and then they have it for children too. And no offense, but it's written by, I think, a lot of it's written by men. And,
Right.
it's like, I
What do we know about
remember,
birthing babies?
right. Or, I remember people saying, because, I have kids from different generations, they would say, let them cry, don't run to them. But everything in my body, John, I mean, I was almost sick. I
Of
was like, I
course.
can't, like, my entire body wanted to go. And I just kept on getting fussed at by everybody. You got to let that baby cry. And I was like, well, he's not crying right now. Then I think, it's like they tell you, put your baby on their back. Don't put your baby on the back. Put him on the stomach. No, I mean, there's this instinct in you.
Right.
Animals don't have books on how to raise their babies. We are even, you
That's
know,
great. That's great.
it's true though.
Yeah.
There's a natural thing. We will get by and especially if you trust yourself.
That's right. But we're taught from the very beginning with those dogmas about original sin and being wicked or being bad or being too stupid or whatever. We're taught that we're supposed to trust them and we're not supposed to ask questions. When we ask questions in those religious settings, I wasn't allowed to ask a question in the cult.
Mm.
And even in some of the other religious settings, even the very last spiritual one I was in, I raised a question about the self and the no self. And I was kind of like chastised by somebody on a comment, like, how dare you question the dogma?
Mm.
I'm like,
Have faith,
well,
blind
how
faith.
dare I not question the dogma? I better
Mm.
question it because, like you said, your personal experience is the only thing that you can verify reliably.
Mm.
You can,
Mm.
other people can tell you and you can believe them, yes, but if you haven't had the experience yourself, you don't absolutely know that it's absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to believe what people tell you, and you don't have to spout it. And it becomes simpler and simpler and simpler. What is all this? Sometimes now, because a friend of mine calls it like this, he says, it's just this. You and all of this out here, it's just this.
Mm. It's not
And
separate.
right, there's no separation. The separation is artificial and based on constructs of the mind. We are totally integrated with everything that we sense. And of
Mm.
course, we know with the planet, that's why destroying the planet is such a bad idea.
Bad idea.
Yeah. I
Mm.
can't believe you're a mom of four. You look so
Oh my
young.
God, guess what? So my oldest is 27, but today my number three is 21.
How? Well, congratulations. You made it
Yeah.
through being a parent and you're still sane? It's an achievement by
Yeah.
itself, right?
No, they keep me sane, if anything. So,
That's wonderful.
yeah, my son who's 21, he is on the spectrum.
Oh, great. And
Yeah.
and so you know a lot of the challenges of being human, and yet
Mhm.
here you are doing these podcasts, asking these great questions, interacting, letting people talk and share what they've learned. It's quite a gift to the audience, and to God and to the world and the rest of us,
That's nice of you to say.
you
I
know.
never thought I would, and I for sure was not the person who ever spoke out. In fact, I used to think that sharing my story, being vulnerable, was a weakness. I'm definitely from a family that was like, you don't tell people your business.
That's right.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, as I work with Irish Catholics, that's very true for many American Irish Catholics and many people in general. Don't tell your business to anybody. But look, how do we really learn how to be human if we don't share these human stories? How does your audience know? They weren't taught any of that in school either, right? And so I think that's where, what we do in these kinds of venues is a different kind of education. And I
Yeah,
feel more like an educator than a spiritual teacher or a therapist,
yeah.
or it's like, hey folks, it's okay to be human and be vulnerable. And I heard one of your guests, I think Dr. Smith, was it? Michael
Mhm.
Smith?
Love Michael Smith.
Super. I didn't get to listen to all of it because it's just before we went on, but he was talking about how originally always it was women coming to him.
Hmm.
And I would say the same for me. 20 years ago, it was gay men and women who were my clients. And
Yeah.
now the number of, I'm going to
Hmm.
say it like the culture, cisgender heterosexual males coming to me is like
Hmm.
off the charts.
Same.
And it's so wonderful that men
Hmm.
are are getting it, that they also know that it actually takes tremendous courage to express what you feel, and vulnerability requires strength, and sharing your struggles
Mm.
requires strength. It's like, okay, I'm not going to fall apart, and if people don't like me, oh well. You
Like
know?
it's okay to heal. In my practice, even just as a massage therapist, I've seen men cry on my table and they can't
Yeah,
even leave afterwards because
yeah,
I just gave them the space to do so and they hadn't had it before.
right.
And, it's a beautiful thing. And I think that is, and I'm a big cheerleader of the divine feminine rising in all of us,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and
Right,
also the divine masculine.
right.
And I think it's very beautiful because we're all the same.
We're all
We're all one.
divine children of God, and Jesus taught something to the Pharisees which the churches never seem to teach us. He said, "The Father and I are one essence."
Mm-hmm.
They pick up stones to stone him for blasphemy, and he turns to them and says, basically, "You idiots! The Bible says we're all the sons of God. In other words, you're the same essence of God that I am."
Mm-hmm.
But what the churches have done is make that into a blasphemy.
Yep.
But in the Hindu tradition, this individual consciousness is God itself. in the Sanskrit, and I've only learned a few Sanskrit words. Ayam Atman Brahman. This individual consciousness is the divine consciousness. And our true nature is Sat, Chit, Ananda. And Sat is truth, and Chit is awareness and consciousness. Ananda is love, contentment or bliss, freedom and peace. That's what we are. That's why we can look here
I
and
love
find
that.
it here. Yeah.
I love that so much. I've been studying the Gnostic Gospels for years now.
I've heard you talk about that, and I've read the Gospel of Thomas not too
Oh,
long
I
ago
love
and
that
thought it
one.
was just brilliant.
Yeah. It's almost like I know you said you studied the New Testament as well. I became curious also, right? Everything falls and you become curious, right? And
That's
so
right.
you learn new things. And I also learned that in my lineages, my dad's, I'm actually Jewish as well.
Oh,
And
wow.
that was something hidden, right? And they came
Hmm.
here and they became Catholics.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is that I looked at my last name. I just learned like a few days ago. So Vavra, so Vav is of course the sixth letter of the alphabet, and I've been
Hmm.
connecting with the sun. It's a whole nother story. But I also just learned I never ever knew this. I don't know how I never, but I found Vavra is as a Sanskrit word. And it means like hidden. And I said, isn't that very interesting? There's so much etymology and and everything. But you know, I've been chanting my last name for some time because of the suggestion from the Hertogs, who wrote Keys
Okay.
of Enoch,
Okay.
and and they suggested I chant Vavra, and I have been for years now since they suggested it,
Hmm.
not even realizing I was chanting Sanskrit as well. I mean, it's a journey that is so unpredictable and so limitless
Hmm. Right.
when you don't have expectations and when you just surrender, and what is there is magical. And like you said, like going out into nature, and it's like being a child again in so
Right.
many ways.
You don't feel any separation, and all of us who feel so isolated and alone in front of our little machines,
Yeah.
every day with our phones and our computers, just
Yeah.
have to put them down for a moment and go outside and breathe the fresh air and just
Mhm.
kind of disappear into your senses. And that's your very first taste of mindfulness and of being present in the moment and of your nature as that awareness that's inextricably intertwined with everything else. It's not
Mhm.
complicated. And what I've seen too is because so many people of intellect have worked these spiritual paths, they seem very complex. But the actual tools that are needed are really simple, right? The
Mhm.
simple chanting, some people like that. But
Mhm.
even if you don't chant, the meditation and the mindfulness, which is really just meditation, it's really just paying attention to your senses. That's uh, pretty much all you need. And so I wrote a book recently called Being Human and Waking Up, and I just
Mhm.
summarized all these very simple things. And I'm going to teach a course about it in January. But you know,
Nice.
these are all the principles that I've learned. But what I've learned as a therapist too, as well as a teacher, is you have to make it really simple because people aren't going to remember complicated stuff when they're in crisis or when they're in a high level of anxiety. You got to keep it really simple. Remember to breathe. Remember to go to your senses. If you have
Mhm.
to count numbers instead of, if you get into a panicky thought set, you just can count from 1 to 10 or 10 to 1.
Mhm.
And
I've
or
done that.
count as you breathe, as you inhale and you exhale, and make your inhale like 2 really deep breaths and your exhale 6 seconds of slow breath.
Yeah.
And those very simple
Yes.
tools are what work the best. I've had all kinds of esoteric experiences bending spoons and I
What?
yeah, you don't know about bending spoons? I'll show
You
you
can
one.
actually bend it?
I, I
Wow.
I haven't done it since the first class I was in. But this guy taught 50 of us in a local classroom here how to merge with the energy of the spoon. And now you
Amen.
don't bend it with your mind, you bend it with your hands, but you couldn't do that. You'd break the thing. If
Right.
you just bend it
I did.
cold, you merge your energy with, right? So there's all kinds of great
Oh,
experiences you
cool.
can have, right? And
Yeah.
I studied energy healing and psychic healing for 3 years. But
Mm-hmm.
what I found again was I actually wanted to empower the individuals. I didn't want to just
Mm-hmm.
be the healer. I wanted to teach people to
Me
heal
too.
themselves. I wanted people to have their power
Yes.
like
Me
you do.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the bells and whistles, the funny things like, spoon bending and even the energy healing. Energy
Amazing.
healing was all about the emotional life. It was
Mm,
the emotion and psychological stuff that was twisting people up in their chakras. And
yeah.
like you, we learned to use the pendulum to read the chakras,
Mm-hmm.
and then they made us put the pendulum down. And all that was really cool, and I loved it.
Yeah.
But at the end, I thought, I want to teach people how to heal themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so that's, I think, the direction I really hope the culture is moving in, that we're moving away from sort of hierarchical,
Yeah.
king-like spiritual settings where the guru is the king and rules everything, or my
Mm-hmm.
cult members were the kings and queens,
Right.
and back to, hey, wait, you actually have everything you need right here in your
Mhm.
own heart and your own mind, and you can figure it out. You need a little start.
Right.
I tell people that if I don't become obsolete in their lives, unless they're really seriously traumatized, and some people need a lot of therapy, then I'm not doing my job.
Wow. You know, I also am really receiving right now is that in my life, and it seems like with you too, to not really hold on so tightly to certain concepts, even if you believe them so strongly now.
That's
I
right.
mean, I have evolved through many, many different experiences of what I believe or what I
That's right.
see right
Hmm.
now to be true, and
Yeah.
then me shift and find a more open or a different way. Like, just don't be so attached, I guess is what I'm saying to constructs.
Well, your listeners who are on the spiritual path know the word surrender. And that doesn't
Yeah.
mean give up to people who are abusing you, by the way. It means
Mhm.
surrender to what is, that you have no power to change. We can all influence things around us with our energy, like the spoon bending. That was really the lesson of that your energy can influence what's around you. But the thing is that reality is in charge and your ego is not. Your ego is a necessary interface with other people, and as Dr. Smith was saying, to keep you safe, right? Distinguish X from Y. That's what Adyashanti taught us. But otherwise, it's not true. There isn't a self there. There's a set of words. And when you take a self away, you also take limitations of what can happen away,
Yeah.
right? Because if I'm defining myself and then defending myself when somebody challenges my little word definitions of myself, that creates a lot of destructive energy. And the other thing about ego is it's like I'm going to try to put the ocean into a little glass of water. I'm going to put eternity, infinity that's expressing in this
Yeah.
human vessel. I'm going to put it into this little tiny container of words. And it's just so not necessary.
Mm.
And it's so much an impediment. So, what I hope for those listening is that they continue to find their heart, their spiritual path, their sense of truth, their own intuition, and that they ferret out, don't believe everybody you see or hear. Let your spidey sense tell you whether it sounds a little too good to be true, because it is, or whether the people want a little too much of you. They want your money, or they want your loyalty, or God forbid, they want your body, which happens in certain spiritual circles
Yeah.
still. I'm still hearing about that. You have what you need inside, and that's what I teach people.
Mm. Amen and woman.
That's great. I love that.
Man, John, thank you so much. I
It's a
feel in my
pleasure.
body right now, very relaxed,
Oh,
very
good.
aligned with you. I'm
Oh, thank you.
resonating big time. And I appreciate you so very much for coming on and sharing your story. Yeah.
It's my pleasure. And because of your generosity, I want to give a gift to your listeners as well, which is that I will give them a 15-minute free consult
Oh.
and or a copy of my book, a PDF of my book, Being Human and Waking Up, for free if they will just DM me on Instagram at John Labman. So that's the @, JON as in Nancy, LAB, M as in Mary, AN as in Nancy again. So if you DM me at John Labman on Instagram, I will send you the book and or the link to make a free 15-minute consult appointment with me. That's all I want to do now. I've got, I'm almost 70. I don't know how much time I have left. That's really what I want to do with my life. So thank you for that. I want to remind your listeners again, please send this wonderful person some love, like the podcast, the 5-star rating, the comment, get involved, and say thank you to Shanna for all she's doing with her very busy life.
Thank you so much. That's so nice of you.
It's a
And
pleasure.
tell everybody your website.
My website is simplyawake.com.
Okay. Love it. Yeah. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, John. Wonderful to meet you and
Wonderful to
many
meet you.
blessings. Yeah.
And many blessings for you too.
Sense of Soul.